Hi, this is John Grant with the REI Policy Institute. The REI Policy Institute is an educational and lobbying arm for the industry funded by Randy Patrick, an investor in Tampa. To learn more about what we do, you can visit reipolicy.com. That's where you can sign up to our YouTube channel, our Facebook page, and you can also subscribe to our newsletter on that site as well. This week, I wanted to get into a little more on housing data. The last newsletter that I put out got pretty heavy into the weeds on some data, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about it and how I think it poses some opportunities for distressed property investors. The first issue I want to look at is, housing affordability, which right now is at, its worst levels in, a long time. The home ownership rate is also at its worst level, I think, in several decades. I want to say as much as 50 years. So we want to first address why this is the case. I think that there are two factors that we can identify as at least heavily responsible for those reasons. Generally, folks point to inventory, and I think that's true. But the question is, why is the housing inventory so low? The demand is supposedly out of control given the prices that you see. So what is creating the low inventory? And I think there are a couple reasons for that. There's no question institutional buying plays some kind of a role. Now, how large that is, when compared to the entire housing market, it's hard to say that can be pinned as the sole reason. But there's no question institutional buying and their buy and rent models have taken a lot of homes off of the market. That's not in dispute. And in fact, you're starting to see some of those models, as they would say, evolve. And there's some of the institutions are looking at having these renters buy the properties. Now, whether or not that was the game plan all along, that they get the renters in there and then eventually sell off the homes and sort of liquidate these investments, I don't know. But I had talked to some institutions prior to some of them getting into this, getting into the residential market, and a lot of them were really committed just to the buy and rent strategy and didn't want more of a blended strategy of buy and flip or buy, rehab, and resell. And I think some of them were actually prevented from doing that based on some of the conversations they had with Fannie and Freddie. But there's no question that a lot of that institutional buying was kind of a bailout of sorts for the government-sponsored enterprises. And I think a second factor about with respect to housing inventory has to do with HAMP, HARP, and principal reduction programs. I talk about this a lot. It's this notion of artificial factors in the market. And when you have those artificial factors, and by artificial, I mean the hand of the government kind of reaching in and saying, look, we're going to develop these programs and keep people in homes, try to extend their stay in homes, some of whom may be qualified, some of them may not be. The redefault rates speak for themselves. But I think that is another factor where, the natural inventory that you would see heading to the market isn't showing up because people are staying in their homes longer who probably shouldn't be. But, a lot of people are curious about the fact that home ownership is at these lows where mortgage rates are still very low. And I think we want to get into why that is. And more importantly, for distressed investors, I think that the artificial interference in the market, it's very rare it works out well, whatever market you're talking about. So I think that could ultimately be beneficial to distressed property folks. I think it's kind of a wait and see on some of that. The other thing that I wanted to talk about that we see a lot with the housing data is the activity of first-time buyers and millennials. With respect to that, we see a convergence of different issues. You have housing policy on the one hand and student loan debt on the other hand with respect to the millennials. I think a lot of them are saddled with debt, and it prevents them, when we see the down payment numbers coming in, we see very low down payments or folks not able to make a down payment. And that's why we've seen these down payment programs that are being, again, created oftentimes with government partnership. And I'll keep my same position that kind of artificial interference, having gone through what we just went through, when we learn that home ownership, if there's no equity in the home and the person wasn't truly qualified, it's not an asset. You're just hanging a debt around someone's neck, and ultimately that has to be relieved. And I think distressed property investors are the folks to do that. And the fact that some politicians will criticize the distressed properties investors for doing that is absurd, and they're simply ignorant of the market. So in general, I think when we look at those few matters, in the final analysis, I think there remain good indications for distressed property investors that there are opportunities available, and more importantly, a lot more on the way in the future. And in that last newsletter that we put out, we discussed a number of cities where a bubble is clearly underway based on objective criteria, things like fraud, flipping rate, and the other factor that you see is the mortgage as a percentage of income has increased dramatically as well, and that's a huge problem. So while it's a problem for that current homeowner, but I think for distressed property investors, it's an opportunity. The last thing I want to get to that I think will help the industry a lot, again, this is fleshed out a lot more in the newsletter because it's a little bit of a complicated issue. But one of the things that I've argued with officials about and have tried to reform and have made clearly some steps is valuation methodology for a house. A lot of investors will say, hey, we come up with these offers and they get turned down, and we think the house is worth one thing, and the banks, working in concert with the GSEs, say that they're worth something else. A document was put out, a study by economists at FHFA, that I think largely supports our position. The premise of the document was what is the best methodology for finding out how much someone will pay for a house, and also predictive data as to who will default. But what it discovered was that using a method of disaggregation when you're talking about highly concentrated populations is a much more effective means of figuring out how much a house is really worth than using aggregate indexes, so indices. So in other words, you might go to a bank and they say, well, homes in this state are generally worth this much, or homes in this county are generally worth this much. The further you drill down, in particular in highly populated areas, the argument is this aggregate data, where you're pulling a whole bunch of examples together, is worthless. It doesn't mean anything. And you need to really hone down very, very closely within the zip code, and you get a much more accurate depiction of how much the house would actually sell for. And you also get, as the study points out, more information on predictive information on how who may actually default on a loan as well. But again, I don't have the time to get into it fully on this, but this notion of disaggregation, I think the more investors know about that, they're in a better position to argue home prices with anybody, really, because they can point to, you're basing your number on bad methodology. And in fact, a government agency, economists there who oversee Fannie and Freddie, have come out with a paper that says disaggregation and drilling down in very close proximity to the home is absolutely the best method to come up with that. So anyway, it's a paper worth taking a look at, and it's something to kind of have in your war chest as an investor to know about. But anyway, that's it for this week. Again, reipolicy.com. You can subscribe to the YouTube channel and to Facebook, and you can also get the letter. I appreciate it. Thank you.